My name's Matthew Wyatt, and this is for Roots of World Issues. This is my TED Talk, if you will, on China's one-child policy. Now, before we take a look at China's one-child policy, I want to see how did they get to this in the first place. Is that in the 60s, this dictator Mao Zedong, he urged the people of China to have as many children as possible. And what this did and what his mindset was is that it would empower the nation. They would become this global giant, that they would outnumber any population of any other country. And the population grew from 540 million in 1949 to 940 million in 1976. And it worked. What he wanted worked. But they grew too quickly. And the country in a whole had to look at how can this be reversed. They were looking at economic and social devastation if the population increase projections were to come true. They said how could we get here and how can we stop it? And my thesis, the question is, how could only 3 decades in the history of China, this global giant, in only 3 decades, this has caused shockwaves that will still be felt in China for decades, if not centuries to come. So let's get started with this one-child policy that was adapted in 1979. And what they would say is, okay, in certain areas of the country, in the rural areas, if the first child was a girl, then they were allowed to have one more. But here's what happened is that the government thought, okay, not only infanticide would happen, but also let's figure out this birth control because we have to slow down this population growth. So women were required to have an IUD surgically installed after the first child. And from 1980 to 2014, 324 million Chinese women were fitted with IUDs. And what happened was that once this policy was lifted, then the government paid to get these IUDs removed, but this caused sterilization in the women because there's complications. And 180 million Chinese women have been sterilized because of this. And it has a huge impact on China's low fertility level that we're going to be feeling for decades to come. And for families who observed the one-child rule, there were rewards. This is how the government wanted to push the one-child policy, these major human rights violations that if you look at it nowadays in the United States or other countries, this is a major human rights violation. But they had rewards for these people. Higher wages, better schooling, unemployment, preferential treatment in government assistance, health care, loans, and for families who violated the one-child policy, there were sanctions. Not only if they worked for the government, there'd be employee termination, but there'd be fines, wage cuts. And for the child to come, they had difficulty in obtaining government assistance of the health care for the child. And then why was it needed? Let's look at why did they think it was needed? But if you look at this in the 1650s, Europe actually had a higher population per millions than China. But then as we go up, if you look at this diagram, if you go up, then in 1950, right before Mao Zedong said, "Hey, have as many children as you can. Let's grow this. Let's become a global powerhouse." Then it spiked, and then the projected population, if you look on this, is in 2050, you are going to have billions more Chinese than Europe and any other country. But here's the thing is that this is the way that they tried to get around it was China's one-child policy most strictly applied to Han Chinese living in urban areas of the country. This is the way that they're thinking, okay, we're not going to do the entire country. What we're going to do is just the Han Chinese. And it didn't apply to the ethnic minorities. But here's where they thought they were getting around it is that more than 91% of the Chinese population is Han Chinese. And just about over 51% of China's population lived in the urban areas. And then they took the rural areas and said, okay, they could apply to have a second child only if the first child was a girl. And they were trying to curb this um, surging population introduced by Mao Zedong. And the reason why it was needed in their mind was to alleviate social, economic, and environmental problems from overpopulated areas. But here's the thing is that it wasn't just the overpopulated areas, it was the fear of the projected population growth that they said we have to curb this now. And if you look at this chart where it says in 1953 laws requiring birth control and abortion passed. Then they did the first step taken for one-child policy amid increased support, except in less populated rural areas. So after this huge surge that Mao Zedong brought, then they're thinking, okay, we need to start talking about this one-child policy. Then in 1970 to 1980, this one-child policy spreads countrywide. 1982 was one-child policy was introduced in Chinese constitution. So not only did they implement it in 79, what they're saying is we're going to stamp it and put it in the constitution. But in 2013, they're thinking, okay, this isn't right. China approves exemption, allowing 2 children for families in which one parent, rather than both, is an only child. But then they said, okay, we're going to go one step further. And in 2015, the one-child policy was abandoned. Only recently, I look at that and I'm thinking it's mind blowing. 4 years is it that it was finally banned. But look at the ramifications that my initial statement of this is going to cause shockwaves for years to come. Is the median age now of the population compared to from the United States, which is just a little over 40 years old, to or nowadays, I'm sorry, it was about 35, almost 40 years old. But then if you look at the increase on what's going to happen is China is going to surge past the United States. And they're projecting in 2050 of the median age of being 50 years old. And you may ask yourself, what are the long-term effects? Infertility. So you have 1 in every 4 people over the age of 65 in China. And in 2015, China had an estimated 150 million single-child families, with an estimated 2/3 of those thought to be a direct result of this policy. Because when you have 91% of the Han Chinese, it's going to have an effect. There are about 113 boys born in China for every 100 girls. While some of this ratio might be biological, there is evidence of sex-selective abortion, neglect, abandonment, and even infanticide of infant females. And the recent peak total fertility rate for Chinese women was in the late 1960s when it was 5.9, get this, 5.9 in 1966 and 1967. But then if you look in 2015, total fertility rate had dropped to 1.6 children per woman, well below the replacement value. So you have this replacement value of how do you keep your country sustainable? And it was 2.1 is like the baseline. And China right now is at 1.6. Do you know what makes up the remaining growth of China is immigration. And they warn that China's population will begin to shrink in the next decade. And it's potentially going to derail the world's second largest economy. So you have this one-child policy for 30 years, you have it in place, and it's going to derail the second largest economy per projection. China's birth rate last year was at its lowest since the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, with 15.23 million births, dramatically lower than the 21 to 23 million officials had expected. And how will the one-child legacy impact the elderly Chinese? If fertility rates remain constant from 2010, by 2050, 46.2% of Chinese over 60 will have only one child. And you look at that, how is this going to grow? Can China recover? By 2050, as much as 1/3 of the country's population will be made up of people over the age of 60. And this will put a severe strain on state services. So in America now, you have Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. It'll put a strain on the state services. And then you have the children, one child, who bear the brunt of caring for the elderly relatives. I love this quote that I got from Yi Fuxian. said China should have stopped the policy 28 years ago. Now it's too late. And he's a senior scientist at the University of Wisconsin. But then, so you have these people, and I'll close with this. You have these people who, in their mind, are like, okay, first you told us to speed up. Then you said, no, we're putting the brakes on it. We're going to do one child. And now you want us to speed it back up again. So even though they're able to, there's a lot of people that don't want to. And you have the fertility rate in China. Look at how the drop that it had from 1960, it peaked in 1970, 73, and then it's dropping to its lowest ever. And this devastating impact will be felt for years to come. And they hope that a relaxed population control policy will resolve the pending labor deficit. May be disappointed at what initially appears to be a lack of interest. Overall, China's one-child policy may have worked too well, and its reversal may have come too late, according to demographers and economists. Even if the birth rate jumped to 2 children per woman in 2016, it will be well into the 2030s or even the 2040s before the children born in this policy change will enter the workplace. So you're having this huge gap between, okay, now we can have more kids, but then they have to grow up and enter the workplace. So this is why the one-child policy will have shockwaves on China for years to come, potentially dropping them from the second largest economy down to who knows, when it should have been stopped because of the human rights violation. But this is why you will see shockwaves for years to come. Thank you so much.